The dust kicked up around Jake Morrison's boots as he rode into the small frontier town of Copper Ridge. His horse, a weathered Mustang named Thunder, snorted and shook its mane, sensing the tension that seemed to hang in the desert air like morning fog. Jake pulled his hat down low over his eyes, scanning the wooden buildings that lined the main street. This wasn't just any town, this was Apache territory, and everyone knew it. Jake had been tracking the notorious bandit known as Black Pete Martinez for 3 weeks now. The outlaw had robbed the Silver Creek Bank and killed 2 innocent people in the process. The bounty on his head was $500, enough money for Jake to finally buy that ranch he'd been dreaming about for years. But, as he rode deeper into Copper Ridge, Jake realized this job might be more complicated than he'd thought. The townspeople watched him with suspicious eyes. Women pulled their children closer when he passed. Men touched the handles of their guns. Jake understood why bounty hunters weren't exactly welcome in most places, especially not in a town that seemed to have its own unspoken rules about justice and survival. He tied Thunder to the hitching post outside the Red Moon Saloon and pushed through the swinging doors. The inside was dim and smoky, filled with the kind of men who asked no questions and expected the same courtesy in return. Jake approached the bar where a heavy-set man with graying whiskers was wiping down glasses. "Whiskey," Jake said, placing a silver coin on the scarred wooden surface. The bartender poured without looking up. "You're new around here?" "Just passing through," Jake replied, taking a sip of the harsh liquor. Most folks who come to Copper Ridge are either running from something or chasing something. "Which one are you?" Jake studied the man's face in the mirror behind the bar. "Depends on how you look at it." Before the bartender could respond, the saloon doors swung open again. A hush fell over the room as a figure entered, someone who commanded attention without saying a word. She was Apache, that much was clear from her features and the way she moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in the desert. But she dressed like any other frontier woman, in a simple brown dress with her long black hair braided down her back. What struck Jake immediately were her eyes. They held a depth of pain and wisdom that seemed far too old for her face. She couldn't have been more than 25, but those eyes had seen things that would break most people. The men in the saloon shifted uncomfortably as she walked past their tables, heading straight for the bar. "Maria," the bartender said with genuine warmth. "The usual?" She nodded silently, and he poured her a glass of water. Jake noticed she never asked for alcohol, never seemed to need anything to dull whatever pain lived behind those haunting eyes. "You're the bounty hunter," she said suddenly, turning to face Jake directly. Her English was perfect, though accented with the musical rhythm of her native tongue. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but he stopped himself. Something in her voice told him she wasn't a threat, at least not in the way he was used to dealing with threats. "Word travels fast in small towns," he said carefully. "Especially when that word involves Black Pete Martinez." She took a sip of water, never breaking eye contact. "You're wasting your time here, Mr. Morrison." Jake was surprised she knew his name, but he didn't let it show. "And why's that?" "Because Pete Martinez isn't the man you're really hunting. He's just the shadow of someone much more dangerous." She set down her glass and studied Jake's face as if she were reading a map. "Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what do you know about the Apache Wars?" "Enough to know they ended years ago," Jake replied, though something in her tone made him uneasy. Maria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The official wars ended, yes. But some fights never really stop. They just change shape, like water finding a new path down a mountain." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "If you insist on staying in Copper Ridge, you should know that nothing here is what it seems. Black Pete Martinez is just the beginning of your problems." With that, she was gone, leaving Jake with more questions than answers and the unsettling feeling that he'd just been warned about something far worse than a simple bank robber. The bartender resumed cleaning glasses, but Jake could see the man's hands were shaking slightly. Whatever Maria had been talking about, it had everyone in this town on edge. "Who is she?" Jake asked. The bartender looked up, his eyes reflecting the same wariness Jake had seen in the woman's gaze. "Maria Delgado. Folks around here call her La Apache, though not usually to her face. Why not? Because the last man who did ended up dead 3 days later. Officially, it was ruled a hunting accident. The bartender leaned closer, lowering his voice. But everyone in Copper Ridge knows better than to believe official stories. Jake finished his whiskey and left money on the bar. As he walked toward the door, he could feel every eye in the saloon following him. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of red and gold. Thunder nickered softly as Jake untied him and led him down the street toward what passed for a hotel in Copper Ridge. But, as he walked, Jake couldn't shake the image of Maria's eyes or the certainty in her voice when she'd warned him. He'd come to this town hunting a simple outlaw, but he was beginning to suspect he'd stumbled into something much more complex and dangerous. The hotel was a 2-story wooden building that had seen better days. Jake paid for a room and stable space for Thunder, then climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor. His room was small and sparse: a bed, a chair, and a window that looked out over the main street. As he unpacked his saddlebags, Jake thought about what Maria had said. Black Pete Martinez was supposed to be hiding somewhere in or around Copper Ridge. The bank robbery in Silver Creek had been brutal and efficient, the work of someone with military training. But if Maria was right, if Martinez was just the shadow of someone much more dangerous, then who was pulling the strings? Jake settled into the chair by the window and watched the street below as darkness fell over the town. Oil lamps flickered to life in windows, casting warm yellow pools of light that only made the shadows seem deeper. This was the kind of place where secrets grew like desert weeds, hardy, hidden, and dangerous if you weren't careful where you stepped. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Black Pete Martinez was planning his next move. But Jake was beginning to understand that catching Martinez might be the least of his worries. The real question was whether he would live long enough to figure out what was really happening in Copper Ridge before it was too late. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of gunshots echoing across the desert. He grabbed his rifle and rushed to the window, but the street below appeared empty except for a few nervous horses tied to hitching posts. The shots had come from somewhere outside town, toward the rocky hills that surrounded Copper Ridge like sleeping giants. By the time Jake had dressed and made his way downstairs, a small crowd had gathered in front of the hotel. The hotel owner, a thin man named Chester, was talking in hushed tones with several townspeople. "What's the shooting about?" Jake asked. Chester looked uncomfortable. "Probably nothing. Sometimes the wind plays tricks with sound out here in the desert." But Jake could see the lie in the man's eyes. These people knew exactly what those gunshots meant, and they were scared. He walked toward the sound, leading Thunder behind him. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. About a mile outside town, he found what he was looking for. 3 men lay dead in a small canyon, their bodies positioned in a way that suggested they'd been caught completely by surprise. Jake dismounted and examined the scene carefully. These weren't random killings, this was an execution. The men wore the typical clothes of ranch hands or drifters, but their boots were too expensive and their guns too well maintained for ordinary cowboys. Jake found wanted posters in one man's saddlebag. They were bounty hunters, just like him. Someone had posted a $500 reward for each of their captures, dead or alive. "You shouldn't be here." Jake spun around to find Maria standing at the edge of the canyon, her brown dress blending with the desert rocks. She moved so quietly he hadn't heard her approach, despite the fact that he'd been listening carefully for any sounds. 3 more men came hunting Black Pete Martinez," she continued, walking down into the canyon. "And now they're dead, just like the others who came before them." "Others?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "You're the 7th bounty hunter to come to Copper Ridge in the past 2 months. The first 6 are all buried in the desert now." Maria knelt beside one of the bodies, her fingers tracing something in the sand. "Someone is using these wanted posters as bait, drawing men like you here to die." Jake studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. "And you know who?" "I know many things, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether you're smart enough to listen." She stood and brushed the dust from her dress. "Black Pete Martinez isn't hiding in Copper Ridge. He's been dead for 3 weeks. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. That's impossible. The bank robbery in Silver Creek happened 10 days ago. Yes, it did. But the man who robbed that bank wasn't Pete Martinez. Someone is using his name, his reputation, to cover their real purpose. Maria walked closer, and Jake could see the intensity burning in her dark eyes. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what do you know about Colonel Samuel Henderson? Jake searched his memory. Union Army officer during the war. Stationed in Arizona Territory for the Apache campaigns. Disappeared about 5 years ago. He didn't disappear. He went underground. Henderson was one of the officers responsible for the massacre at Broken Creek, 57 Apache women and children murdered while their men were away hunting. Maria's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the pain flickering across her face. My family was at Broken Creek. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. The fear in the townspeople's eyes, the way Maria moved like someone always ready to fight or flee, the precision of the killings Jake had just discovered. Henderson is here, Jake said. It wasn't a question. He's been here for months, building an army of men who don't ask questions about their orders. The bank robbery was just a way to fund his operations. But the bounty on Martinez's head serves a different purpose. It draws potential threats to Copper Ridge where Henderson can eliminate them before they become a problem. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. So I'm walking into a trap. You walked into it the moment you arrived in town yesterday. The only question now is whether you're going to try to walk back out. Maria turned to leave, then stopped. There's something else you should know about Colonel Henderson. He didn't just kill Apache families during the war. He enjoyed it. And he's planning something much bigger than bank robberies and dead bounty hunters. What kind of something bigger? Henderson believes the Apache wars never really ended. He thinks the government was too soft, too willing to make treaties and establish reservations. He wants to finish what he started permanently. Jake felt sick. You mean genocide? He's been recruiting men from all over the territory. Telling them stories about Apache raiding parties, convincing them that the only way to be safe is to eliminate the threat completely. Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He plans to attack the reservation at Pine Ridge in 2 days. Over 300 people live there, men, women, children, elders. All of them will die unless someone stops Henderson. Why are you telling me this? You don't know me. For all you know, I could be working with Henderson. Maria smiled sadly. Because I've been watching you since you arrived. The way you examined those bodies, the questions you asked, the fact that you're still alive to have this conversation, it tells me you're not like the others Henderson has killed. You actually care about finding the truth. Jake looked back at the 3 dead bounty hunters, then at Maria. What happened to your family at Broken Creek? My mother, my sister, my grandmother. Shot down like animals while they were preparing food for the evening meal. Maria's composure never wavered, but Jake could see the old grief in her eyes. I was 15, away gathering herbs with some other girls. We heard the gunshots and hid in the rocks until Henderson's men were gone. And you've been planning revenge ever since. Not revenge. Justice. There's a difference, Mr. Morrison. Revenge is about anger. Justice is about preventing Henderson from murdering more innocent people. Maria turned and began walking away. You have a choice to make. You can ride out of Copper Ridge tonight and probably live to hunt other outlaws. Or you can help me stop a monster from completing what he started 5 years ago. Wait, Jake called after her. If I stay, what exactly are you suggesting we do? It's just the 2 of us against Henderson and, however, many men he's recruited. Maria paused at the top of the canyon. Sometimes 2 people who know the truth can accomplish more than an army of men who believe lies. Meet me at the old mission ruins north of town tonight if you decide to stay. Come alone, and come ready to fight. With that, she disappeared among the rocks, leaving Jake alone with 3 corpses and a decision that would either save hundreds of lives or cost him his own. As Jake rode Thunder back toward Copper Ridge, he he tried to process everything Maria had told him. Colonel Henderson, a man supposedly dead or missing, was using the town as a base to plan a massacre. The bank robbery, the dead bounty hunters, even the atmosphere of fear that hung over the entire area all made sense now. But it also meant Jake was completely outgunned and outnumbered. Even if Maria was telling the truth, even if she was as skilled a fighter as she seemed to be, they were facing impossible odds. Henderson would have dozens of men, weapons, supplies, and the advantage of familiar terrain. On the other hand, Jake couldn't forget what Maria had said about Pine Ridge. 300 innocent people, including children and elders, marked for death by a madman's twisted version of justice. Could he really ride away and let that happen? By the time he reached town, Jake had made his decision. He spent the day carefully observing the people of Copper Ridge, looking for signs of Henderson's presence. What he found confirmed Maria's story. Too many strangers had arrived in recent weeks, hard men who carried themselves like soldiers. They stayed together, drank together, and watched everyone else with the cold eyes of people preparing for war. As the sun set over the desert, Jake loaded his weapons and prepared to meet Maria at the mission ruins. He had no idea what she was planning, but he knew one thing for certain: tonight would determine whether Colonel Henderson's war ended or whether it claimed hundreds more innocent lives. The old mission stood like a broken promise against the star-filled sky. Its adobe walls had crumbled in places, leaving gaps that looked like missing teeth in a skull's grin. Jake approached carefully, every sense alert for danger. Maria had said to come alone, but that didn't mean Henderson's men weren't watching. He found Maria waiting in what had once been the mission's main chapel. She'd built a small fire in a metal basin, and the flickering light cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls. She'd changed from her brown dress into clothing more suitable for what lay ahead: dark pants, a fitted shirt, and a gun belt that looked well used. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said without turning around. "Neither was I, until about an hour ago." Jake stepped into the circle of firelight. "I saw Henderson's men in town." "You're right about them building an army." Maria nodded grimly. 37 men at last count. All veterans, all believers in Henderson's cause. They think they're going to be heroes, saving the territory from savage Indians. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. "How do we stop 37 armed men with just the two of us? We don't fight them directly. We're not trying to win a war, Mr. Morrison. We're trying to prevent one." Maria turned to face him, and Jake was struck again by the intensity in her dark eyes. "Henderson's strength comes from his men's belief that they're righteous crusaders. If we can expose the truth about what he really is, that strength becomes weakness." Jake frowned. "What truth?" "Colonel Henderson wasn't just a soldier who went too far during wartime. He's been stealing from the government for years." The attack on Broken Creek wasn't about military strategy, it was about covering up evidence that Henderson had been selling army supplies to Mexican bandits. Maria pulled a leather portfolio from behind a pile of stones. "These are documents I've spent 2 years gathering. Bills of sale, shipping records, correspondence with buyers south of the border." Jake examined the papers by firelight. Even his limited reading skills were enough to understand what he was seeing. Henderson had been running a criminal enterprise that made the bank robbery look like petty theft. "How did you get these?" Henderson kept meticulous records of his illegal activities. He's proud of his business sense, even if he's ashamed of nothing else. These documents were hidden in a safe house he maintained in Silver Creek. Maria's smile was cold. The same safe house where he planned the bank robbery that everyone thinks was committed by Black Pete Martinez. "So we take these to the territorial authorities. Let them handle Henderson." "With what authority?" "Henderson still has friends in the army, men who believe his version of events at Broken Creek. And even if we could convince someone in power to act, it would take weeks to organize a response. The attack on Pine Ridge is planned for tomorrow night." Jake studied the documents again, thinking. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Henderson's men are meeting tomorrow evening to receive their final orders for the attack. They're gathering at an old ranch house about 10 miles south of here. If we can get these documents to them, show them who they're really working for. Some of them might refuse to participate. And the others? Will probably try to kill us. Maria said it matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather. But, without unified support from his men, Henderson won't be able to launch a coordinated attack on the reservation. At worst, he'll only have a handful of the most devoted followers left. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. What Maria was proposing was essentially suicide. They would be walking into a camp full of armed men and trying to convince them to turn against their leader. Even if some of Henderson's followers could be swayed by the evidence, others would shoot first and worry about documents later. "There's something you're not telling me," Jake said finally. "Something about why you're so determined to do this yourself instead of finding another way." Maria was quiet for so long that Jake began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Henderson didn't just kill my family at Broken Creek. He made me watch." She stared into the flames, and Jake could see the nightmare playing out behind her eyes. He wanted information about other Apache camps, about where the warriors were hunting. He thought watching my family die would make me talk. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. "But you didn't." "I was 15 years old and terrified out of my mind. But I didn't tell him anything, because I knew that if I did, he would kill more families. So I stayed silent while he shot my mother. Stayed silent while he killed my little sister. Stayed silent while he murdered my grandmother, who could barely walk and had never harmed anyone in her entire life." Jake closed his eyes, trying to shut out the images her words created. "Maria. He left me alive because he thought the guilt would eventually break me down. He thought I would come looking for him, desperate to trade information for some kind of forgiveness that would never come." Maria looked up at Jake, and he saw something in her expression that made him understand why people called her La Apache with such fearful respect. He was wrong. "I didn't come looking for forgiveness. I came looking for justice. And if we both die tomorrow night? What happens to the people at Pine Ridge then? Then, at least we'll have tried to save them. Sometimes that's all anyone can do." Maria stood and began gathering her weapons. "But I don't plan to die tomorrow, Mr. Morrison. I plan to look Colonel Samuel Henderson in the eye and watch him realize that the 15-year-old girl he tried to break grew up to be the woman who destroyed everything he's worked for." Jake watched her prepare for what would likely be their final battle. There was something magnificent and terrible about her determination, like watching a force of nature prepare to reshape the landscape. He'd come to Copper Ridge hunting a simple outlaw and found himself face to face with a woman whose entire life had become a weapon aimed at the heart of injustice. "Tell me about the ranch house where they're meeting," Jake said, making his own final decision. Maria looked up, surprise flickering across her features. "You're really going to do this? Those people at Pine Ridge don't deserve to die for Henderson's madness. And what he did to your family." Jake checked his rifle, making sure it was properly loaded. "Some things can't be allowed to stand." For the first time since he'd met her, Maria smiled with genuine warmth. "The ranch house sits in a valley with only one way in and out. Henderson chose it because it's defensible, but that also means his men will feel trapped when they realize what's happening." "What exactly is our plan?" "We ride in during the meeting. I present the evidence to Henderson's men while you watch for trouble. We appeal to whatever conscience they have left and hope that facing the truth about their leader is enough to make them abandon his cause." Jake laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "That's not a plan. That's barely even a hope. Hope is what we have, Mr. Morrison. Hope and the truth and the belief that sometimes good people do the right thing when they're given the chance." Maria extinguished the fire and shouldered her pack. "Tomorrow evening, we find out if that's enough." As they prepared to leave the ruined mission, Jake caught Maria's arm gently. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I understand why this matters to you. What Henderson did to your family, what he's planning to do to Pine Ridge, it's not just about revenge or justice. It's about making sure that innocent people don't have to pay the price for one man's hatred." Maria nodded, and Jake could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes.
Thank you for understanding. And, thank you for staying. Don't thank me yet. We still have to live through tomorrow night.
They rode out of the mission ruins together, heading back toward Copper Ridge under a sky full of stars that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained men like Colonel Henderson. Tomorrow would bring either salvation for the people of Pine Ridge or death for everyone who stood in Henderson's way. But, tonight, for just a few hours, Jake and Maria rode side by side through the desert, two people united in their determination to stand against injustice, no matter what the cost. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Jake and Maria reached the ridge overlooking Henderson's ranch house. Below them, lamplight spilled from the windows of the old building, and they could see horses tied to hitching posts, more horses than Jake had expected.
Henderson's army was larger than Maria had estimated. 43 men, Maria whispered, counting the animals. He's been busy recruiting since yesterday.
Jake studied the layout through his spyglass. The ranch house sat in the center of a natural bowl, surrounded by rocky hills on three sides. The only way in or out was through a narrow pass that would funnel anyone approaching into clear sight of the building. Henderson had chosen his meeting place well. There, Maria pointed to a figure standing on the ranch house porch.
Colonel Samuel Henderson.
Even at a distance, Jake could see that Henderson carried himself with military bearing. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. He moved among his followers with easy confidence, shaking hands and clapping shoulders like a politician greeting supporters. He doesn't look like a monster, Jake observed.
The most dangerous monsters never do.
They look like leaders, like men you can trust. Maria's voice was tight with controlled emotion. That's how they convince good people to do terrible things. As they watched, Henderson raised his hands for attention. The men gathering around the ranch house fell silent, turning expectant faces toward their leader. Even from their position on the ridge, Jake could hear the colonel's voice carrying across the valley. Gentlemen, tomorrow we finish what should have been completed years ago. The Apache threat to our families and our future ends forever. A cheer went up from the assembled men. Jake felt sick listening to their enthusiasm for mass murder. We need to get down there, Maria said, checking her weapons one final time. Once Henderson finishes his speech, they'll break up into smaller groups to receive specific orders. That's our best chance to reach them with the truth. Jake nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to find another way. They were about to walk into a hornet's nest with nothing but hope and a handful of documents. But the alternative was watching Henderson's men ride out tomorrow to slaughter innocent people. They made their way carefully down the rocky slope, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. The closer they got to the ranch house, the more clearly they could hear Henderson's voice weaving his spell of hatred and fear. The government has been weak, gentlemen. They've made treaties with savages who understand only violence. They've created reservations that serve as breeding grounds for future attacks on our children. Henderson's voice carried the practiced rhythm of a man accustomed to commanding audiences. But we know better. We know that the only way to ensure peace is to eliminate the threat completely. More cheers. Jake could see individual faces now in the lamplight spilling from the windows, weathered men with hard eyes and determined expressions. These weren't evil people, he realized. They were frightened people who'd been convinced that murder was justified by necessity. Wait here, Maria whispered as they reached the bottom of the valley. When I give the signal, create a distraction. Draw their attention away from Henderson.
What signal? You'll know. Maria checked the leather portfolio containing Henderson's incriminating documents. Remember, these men aren't our enemies. They're victims of Henderson's lies. If we can reach them with the truth, some of them will listen. Jake wanted to argue, to find some other way that didn't require Maria to walk alone into a crowd of armed men prepared to commit genocide. But there wasn't time for alternatives. Tomorrow, 300 innocent people would die unless something changed tonight. Maria straightened her shoulders and walked out of the shadows toward the ranch house. Jake watched in amazement as she transformed herself before his eyes. Gone was the haunted woman who'd shared the story of her family's murder.
In her place stood someone who radiated quiet authority and absolute fearlessness. "Colonel Henderson," Maria called out, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade.
The effect was immediate and electric.
Every man in the gathering turned toward her, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. Henderson himself went rigid, as if he'd seen a ghost walking toward him across the desert. "La Apache," Henderson said, and Jake could hear the shock in his voice even from 30 yards away.
"I thought you were dead."
"That was your first mistake." Maria stepped into the circle of light around the ranch house, and Jake could see her clearly now. She moved like a woman walking to her own execution, but her head was high and her eyes blazed with purpose.
"Your second mistake was thinking you could hide from justice forever."
Henderson recovered his composure quickly.
"Men, we have an unexpected guest.
The famous La Apache has decided to honor us with her presence." Several of Henderson's followers raised their rifles, but the colonel waved them down.
Now, gentlemen. Where are our manners? The lady has come to speak with us. We should hear what she has to say."
Jake could hear the mockery in Henderson's voice, but he could also detect something else: nervousness. Henderson hadn't expected Maria to find him, and her presence had disrupted his carefully planned evening. "I've come to show your men who you really are, Colonel." Maria reached for the leather portfolio, and immediately a dozen guns were pointed at her. She froze, hands visible, waiting.
Slowly, Henderson commanded.
Maria carefully withdrew the documents and held them up so the assembled men could see them.
"These are records of Colonel Henderson's real activities during the Apache Wars.
Bills of sale for stolen army supplies.
Correspondence with Mexican bandits. Evidence that the attack on Broken Creek wasn't about military necessity, it was about covering up Henderson's crimes."
"That's enough," Henderson snapped, but Jake could see that some of his men were listening intently. "He sold rifles and ammunition to the very people he claimed to be fighting," Maria continued, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "He prolonged the war for profit while good soldiers died believing they were serving their country."
"She's lying," Henderson shouted. "This is exactly the kind of Apache treachery we're here to prevent."
But Jake could see doubt creeping into some faces in the crowd. These were veterans, men who understood military protocol and knew what proper documentation looked like.
They were beginning to question what they'd been told.
That was when Henderson made his fatal mistake. Instead of trying to discredit the documents or explain them away, he reached for his gun. "Some lies are too dangerous to be allowed to spread," Henderson said, drawing his weapon.
The words hung in the air for a moment that seemed to last forever.
Then, Maria spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Please, stop." The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried across the valley with devastating effect. Jake realized that Maria was no longer speaking to the crowd, she was speaking directly to Henderson, and her voice carried all the pain and terror of a 15-year-old girl watching her family die. "Please, stop," she repeated, and Jake saw Henderson's face change as the memory crashed over him. The memory of a terrified Apache girl begging him to spare her family while he methodically murdered everyone she loved. Henderson's gun wavered in his hand. For just a moment, he saw himself through Maria's eyes, not as a righteous crusader, but as a monster who had tortured a child and called it justice.
That moment of hesitation was all Jake needed.
He fired a shot into the air, and chaos erupted in the valley.
Men scattered, seeking cover, unsure who was shooting or why.
In the confusion, Maria dove toward the ranch house, still clutching the documents that could save Pine Ridge. But Henderson recovered from his shock faster than Jake had hoped. The colonel's gun swung toward Maria, and Jake knew with horrible certainty that he was too far away to stop what was about to happen. "This ends now," Henderson snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger.
The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the night air.
But it wasn't Henderson who fired. One of his own men, a grizzled veteran named Tom Carson, had put a bullet through the colonel's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying into the darkness. "That's enough, Henderson," Carson said, his rifle still smoking. "I didn't sign up to murder children, and I sure as hell didn't sign up to follow a thief and a liar."
Other voices joined Carson's as the truth of Maria's revelations sank in.
Men who had been ready to commit massacre just minutes earlier were now turning their weapons on the leader who had deceived them. Henderson clutched his wounded shoulder, looking around desperately for support. But the spell he had woven was broken. His army was dissolving before his eyes as men faced the truth about what they had almost done.
"You're all cowards," Henderson spat.
"Weak men who don't have the stomach to do what's necessary." "What's necessary," Carson replied, "is making sure you never hurt anyone again." As Henderson's former followers closed in around him, Jake made his way down to where Maria stood in the center of the chaos. She was shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation finally leaving her system. "It's over," Jake told her gently.
"Henderson's finished."
Maria nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the man who had destroyed her family.
"Not yet. He needs to answer for what he did at Broken Creek." Henderson laughed bitterly. "You think this changes anything? You think justice matters in a world where might makes right?"
He looked directly at Maria, and Jake saw the same cruel intelligence that had once tortured a 15-year-old girl.
"I remember you, little Apache. You were so brave when your family was dying. Are you still that brave now?" Jake expected Maria to respond with anger or threats.
Instead, she walked closer to Henderson until she was standing just a few feet away from the man who had haunted her dreams for 5 years.
"I'm not that frightened girl anymore, Colonel. And you're not the powerful man who murdered my family.
You're just a broken old soldier who confused cruelty with strength." Maria's voice was steady, almost gentle.
"I forgive you." Henderson's face went white with shock. "What?"
"I forgive you for what you did to my family. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying your hatred was poisoning everything good in my life." Maria turned away from him, addressing the men who had gathered around them. "Take him to the territorial authorities. Let them decide his fate." As Carson and several other men secured Henderson for transport, Jake found himself staring at Maria in amazement. After everything she had suffered, after years of planning for this moment, she had chosen forgiveness over revenge.
"How?" Jake asked simply.
Maria looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky.
"Because justice isn't about making the guilty suffer. It's about protecting the innocent."
Henderson will face trial for his crimes, but the people at Pine Ridge will live to see another sunrise.
That's what matters.
3 days later, Jake sat on Thunder at the edge of Copper Ridge, preparing to leave. Henderson was in custody, his followers had dispersed, and the threat to Pine Ridge had ended. His work here was done. Maria approached on foot, wearing her simple brown dress again. But Jake could see that something fundamental had changed in her. The weight of old pain no longer bowed her shoulders, and her eyes held peace instead of haunted memory. "You're leaving," she observed.
"Nothing keeping me here anymore."
"Henderson's in jail, the real Black Pete Martinez has been dead for weeks, and there's no bounty to collect."
Jake paused. "What about you? What will you do now?"
Maria smiled, and Jake realized it was the first completely genuine smile he'd seen from her.
"I'm going to teach children at the mission school in Silver Creek. It's time to build something good instead of just fighting against something evil." Jake nodded, understanding. "If you ever need help with anything at all, you can find me."
"Word gets around about where bounty hunters are working."
"Thank you, Jake Morrison. For everything."
Maria reached up and touched his hand briefly.
"Ride safe."
As Jake rode away from Copper Ridge, he thought about the woman he was leaving behind. La Apache had become Maria Delgado again, ready to start a new chapter of her life. The eyes that had once held so much pain now looked toward the future with hope. Behind him, the desert stretched endlessly under the afternoon sun.
Ahead lay new towns, new outlaws, new adventures.
But Jake knew he would never forget the woman who had taught him that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't found in facing down dangerous men with guns. Sometimes the greatest courage was found in choosing forgiveness when revenge would have been so much easier. The memory of Maria's voice would stay with him always, not the desperate plea for mercy she had offered as a terrified girl, but the calm certainty of a woman who had chosen to heal rather than to hate. In a land where violence often seemed like the only answer to injustice, Maria had found another way. And, in doing so, she had shown Jake that there was still hope for redemption, even in the wildest corners of the frontier.